Hi everybody, I've got another lecture for you today. We're going to be talking about the radical phase of the French Revolution, which really lasts from, I would say, the beginning of the declaration of the French Republic, so when they abolished the monarchy, to the you could say the end of the Reign of Terror, or you could also say the beginning of the new government. So roughly 1792 to 95, with 1793 to 94, the Reign of Terror being kind of the most intense, the most radical phase. So here's what I want you to be able to do today. First off, there's a ton of terms in here. So I would have your term list next to you as you listen to this. I want you to be able to think about why the French Revolution got more radical. So what are the causes of this radicalization? And then I want you to be able to compare the two political parties, the Girondins and the Montagnard. I want you to be able to recreate the political spectrum. And then I want you to analyze the success of all of these reforms. So, just to give you a little periodization here, the last phase that we talked about started in 1789, roughly from the convocation of the Estates General in May of 1789. And then I would say by September of 1792, the bourgeois phase is over. They've decided they're not going to have a king, they're going to have a republic. Then we have several years of rule by the National Convention. The National Convention would take over as just the legislative branch, but kind of a dictatorial legislative branch because they're ruling without an executive branch. So they don't have a king anymore and they haven't elected a president or anything like that. The Girondins they're kind of the more moderate political party. They're in control from 1792 to 93. The Jacobins are in control from 1793 to 94, and it's during this period that we have the Reign of Terror. And really, I would say that's actually more the Montagnard, who are kind of the most radical portion of the Jacobins. And then the Thermidorian reaction is from 1794 to 95. This will be at the end of the Reign of Terror until the creation of a new constitution. Because remember, the Constitution of 1791, basically gone now, right? Now that they've declared a republic, that's null and void. It only lasts for a year. So they create a new constitution, which will last for 4 years. Sorry to spoil it for you. The directory is not going to last either. So all of this kind of explodes with the publication of the Brunswick Manifesto in Paris. August 9th to 10th, the people of Paris are so angered by the publication of the Brunswick Manifesto, and also because the king had vetoed several legislative efforts, they storm the Tuileries palace. They assume that the king was involved with the Brunswick Manifesto, and actually the storming of the Tuileries will confirm the king's treason, that he had in fact asked for international aid in his protection, which they see as a violation of their trust. They will then declare the French Republic on September 22nd, 1792. This is a date you need to remember. This is day one, year one of the new French Republic. One of their first actions will be to pass the Decree of Fraternity, which offers assistance to any peoples wanting to overthrow their monarch. So, they don't have enough on their hands. Why not offer to help everybody else? We're going to talk a little bit about all of these political groups, and I want to just kind of go over a modern political spectrum. We'll talk about this more in class, but just to give you kind of an overview, when people talk about left and right, this is roughly what they're talking about. So we have these extremists on the far left and the far right. These are really 20th century political ideas, though. They don't exist in the 19th century during the French Revolution. So all of our politics here in the French Revolution are going to be happening kind of from here to here. We have centrists, we have liberals and conservatives. So kind of going from center to left. Liberals would be kind of like the modern American Democratic Party, right? Like they're looking for maybe some wealth redistribution, taxing the wealthy, providing social programs. But really, that idea is going to come out of the New Deal programs in the 20th century as a result of the Depression. Socialism never really takes hold in the U.S. It's kind of actively demonized. It's kind of the mainstream. Like the liberal parties in Europe, though, are socialist parties. And this is the party of workers, right? Their goal is to support labor unions, to make sure that workers have rights, and so on. Now, communism takes that further. They're looking at completely destroying the state, right? Start over completely, get rid of all private property. Socialists don't go quite that far. Now, on the right side of the political spectrum, you tend to have more conservatives are more looking to support companies to give them, for instance, tax benefits that might encourage them to hire more people. And then I don't know what to put between conservatives and fascists. I do definitely think that there's a group here now. I think like the Tea Party fits under here, but it's less of a party than the socialists are in Europe. So here you could put these kind of anti-immigrant groups. As you go to the right, people are more concerned with sort of putting nation first, right? So fascists are ultra-nationalists, looking to actually purge anti-German elements from the German state, really emphasizing the importance of the state. When you look at communists and fascism, there's sometimes some overlap in terms of the structure of the government, like they both rule by terror, for instance. But these are really kind of 20th century totalitarian ideas that we don't see in the 19th century. So then in the 1790s, we have a similar kind of left-right distribution. So the plain is in the center. They are often kind of a swing vote that might go either way. The Montagnards are the most radical group. They're on the far left. They're really looking to kind of start over from scratch. The Girondins, I would say, are a little bit slower. They want to slow down the revolution. And then the monarchists, of course, want to kind of go back to the ancien regime, keep the monarchy or restore it eventually. So those are kind of our big groups. Now, the Jacobins actually encompass a very wide range. So you've got the monarchists here. They will eventually kind of purge or basically execute the Girondin elements of the Jacobin party. But originally they're this fairly large group of people, just kind of all the revolutionaries. The Jacobins were a debating society. It's a lot of middle class support. A very influential political club during the Revolution. And as I said, it included both the Montagnard and the Girondins. So the Montagnard's going to be Robespierre and the other radicals. And then the Girondins are the more moderates. And they will eventually purge and eliminate all of the Girondins. Another group that we need to think about is not so much a political party, because Sans-Culottes might be involved in different political groups, but a social class. So we have the bourgeoisie. The working class are called the Sans-Culottes. So culottes were these fancy short pants that the monarchists and wealthy people wore. The Sans-Culottes were without culottes, so they wore regular pants, basically. They wore long pants because they were workers, right? So this might be tradesmen and shopkeepers and stuff. They might share a lot of the same middle-class values as the bourgeoisie, but at various points they might sway in different directions. So they end up being a little bit of a swing vote too, but they're not necessarily members of the plain. Like, different groups can support different people at different times. The Sans-Culottes, like the plain, often acted as a swing vote. Some of the political conflict that we're going to talk about, most of it is between the Montagnards and the Girondins. So I want to tell you a little about what they support. The Sans-Culottes both supported the Montagnards, and the Montagnards would support a lot of Sans-Culottes projects. Most of their support came from Paris, and they wanted, as a result, a stronger, more centralized government, kind of centered in Paris. They voted to execute the king and would dominate the National Assembly the National Convention, that should say, from 1793 to 94. They're happily revolutionary. They're throwing everything out and starting over. The Girondins, on the other hand, most of their support came from outside of Paris. They were pretty afraid of the Sans-Culottes. They were afraid of mob rule in general, and supported a more federalized government where each region of Paris would have a say in the government without this strong kind of centralized or executive. They would dominate the National Convention from 1792 to 93, and they really wanted to slow down the revolution. So, for instance, most of them voted to exile the king. Just send him out of the country. We don't need to chop off his head. Just spoiler alert, the king's head is about to get chopped off on January 21st, 1793. Because of those documents found in the Tuileries that proved he'd encouraged foreign intervention, he's put on trial and then executed on January 21st with a vote of 387 to 334. They call this the death of Citizen Louis Capet because he was no longer the king, right? So they called him just Citizen Louis Capet to strip him of his title. This is not a very big majority, right? I think if you're going to do something radical like kill your king, that's a relatively tight vote. It's not showing a huge consensus. Here's just another, I've got a lot of pictures here from various museums. This is one of him being brought up to the guillotine. All of the conventions, by the way, took place in this palace, or I don't know how to say it in French, but the place of the revolution, the Concorde Square in Paris. If you're ever there, it's near the Louvre. So the National Convention is going to pass quite a lot of reforms, trying to control this crisis. Like the revolution's kind of running amok. They still need money, right? They're at war now with all of these people because the War of the First Coalition is going on. So they need to raise money. So one thing that they do is they print more assignats. Now, this is going to have devastating effects. It's going to lead to galloping inflation, as we talked about last time. They're also going to try to control anti-revolutionary sentiment. So they create these revolutionary tribunals. And revolutionary tribunals, that should actually be in red because that's one of your terms, were basically show trials. So you didn't necessarily have a right to know what you were charged with. You didn't have a lot of time to prepare your defense. They'd kind of try you, send you out the door, and execute you the next day, or maybe that afternoon. They also created these representatives on mission who were given almost absolute power in the countryside. They're in charge of conscription, so trying to get force people into military service. They had a levee and masse. The levee and masse is just means the draft. They had conscription, which was unusual in Europe and one of the reasons for the success of the French Revolutionary troops. The Committee of Public Safety was created as one committee on the National Convention. They become kind of the de facto government. So the National Convention really was ruling the show, and the Committee of Public Safety was ruling the National Convention. Maximillian Robespierre is the head of what's often just called the CPS, or the Committee of Public Safety. They are using those revolutionary tribunals to keep control and to get rid of political enemies. The other thing we need to talk about is Marie Antoinette, because she's still alive and she's really being demonized. Now, she had been demonized for a long time. She was called early on Madame Deficit because of all of her spending, but it gets pretty intense with some pretty actual pornographic pamphlets that I'm not showing you because they're pretty X-rated, but mocking her. And here's just a quote from the reading that you'll be doing later. On page 22, the Austrian tigress was regarded in every court as the most miserable prostitute in France. It was impossible to tell which lout was responsible for the puny, gangrened hunchbacks that came out of her three-tiered belly. So, pretty intense critique of her, right? And here she's shown as this amphibious monster, pretty heavily demonized. She's actually going to be put on trial. So she's put in prison at the Concierge, which is near Notre Dame. If you're in Paris, it's a pretty interesting tour. You can see all of it's basically a prison, or it was used as a prison during the Revolution. There's a show trial. So one of these revolutionary tribunals puts her on trial. Her son, the Dauphin, is forced to testify against her that she had sexually assaulted and molested him, which there's no evidence that ever happened. She is convicted and then executed in October of 1793. You can see, I just showed this picture that I took at the Concierge because you can see, how far she's fallen. Like she's not living in her fancy room at Versailles anymore. I also thought this little puppet of her was a little bit creepy. When the new republic is founded, they are going to create a new revolutionary calendar. So day one, year one of the new calendar is September 22nd, 1792. It lasts until 1806. And you have to think about how disruptive this must have been. Like, you used to know how time works, but now you have no idea what's going on. You've got to get completely readjusted. I'm sure there's a lot of translating for a long time. The new calendar had 10 months. And you can see how it was broken down here. They're kind of broken down by season. So these are the names. You don't need to memorize these or anything, but a couple of these will come up. Like Thermidor is, when we talk about the Thermidorian reaction, it's because it started in the month of Thermidor. So some of these terms that we'll use, like the Law of 22 Prairal, took place on the 22nd day of Prairal. They also created a new clock. So they now had decimal time with 100 seconds in every minute, 100 minutes in every hour, and 10 hours in every day. And this revolutionary clock, you can see the Liberty cap there and the tricolor, but also a conversion. So you could tell decimal time sort of with the old 24-hour time. I did the math on this once because I couldn't figure out how it would quite match up. They actually had to change the duration of a second in order to make it still 24 hours long, because the sun wasn't changing, just the clocks. There were some lasting reforms that would last from these National Convention reforms. One was the adoption of the metric system, and this is kind of a pamphlet here showing people using these different metric weights. Another was the founding of the Louvre. This is inside of the Louvre, basically saying that it was founded on the 16th of September, 1792, by decree of the Legislative Assembly. And would open in I forget if that's August or April of 1793. But this is a big deal, right? They've taken all of these treasures of the French monarchy, and they're putting all of this art and beautiful things in a museum, which, by the way, used to be a palace, to make them available to the public. They also continue. Now, we talked before about the how they had confiscated the state land. They're going to go further with this, a whole on De-Christianization program. So they'll remove all of the religious objects. For instance, all church property that still remained would now belong to the state. In October of 1793, any priests who didn't swear an oath to the state and anyone who hid them was sentenced to immediate death upon discovery. No trial for them. They also banned any public exercise of religion. And if you think about France, which is a pretty Catholic country, this is going to alienate a lot of people. Even Robespierre will get them to back off of this a bit. They need new festivals, though, right? You can't just take Christmas away from people and then not expect them to be happy. So they create new festivals. These revolutionary cults created the Festival of the Supreme Being and what they call the Cult of Reason. So these are meant to celebrate reason, and to an extent Robespierre tries to co-opt that to celebrate him a little bit. Some of you will read an article by Mona Ozouf, who writes about the importance of these French revolutionary festivals, because if you really want to make people happy, give them a day off, right? And let them party. I remember a quote from her talking about the reign of night and wine and how it released everything stored in Pandora's box. But she thought of it like a pressure valve, that it would release all this pressure and explode, and then you could kind of pack it back in and keep things stable after the festival was over. Notre Dame would be renamed the Temple of Reason. Just a couple of pictures that I took from Notre Dame before it burned last year. This is kind of the front of it. It's got these two towers, and then you can see these flying buttresses. It's a very famous Gothic cathedral. But now it was the Temple of Reason. I just have to click on this to show you this little animation that I borrowed from somebody. But the guillotine, you can see the little king getting his head cut off up there. The guillotine is put into place as a revolutionary, an equal means of execution. Because some people couldn't afford a talented executioner. They might just have someone with like a dull axe. Well, the guillotine was meant to be equal execution. The revolutionary tribunals are going to execute somewhere around 2,700 victims over the course of 15 months. Nationwide, the death count's probably closer to 20 to 50,000. Some 300,000 are arrested. those death counts are so high, not just because they were anti-revolutionary, some of them just didn't want to be drafted, or they were against the De-Christianization program, but any of that was seen as anti-revolutionary sentiment that should be punished. Oh, I love that quote from Robespierre, by the way, too. Georges Danton was the Minister of Justice who was involved early on in these terrors. He oversaw the revolutionary tribunals. For Jacobin, though, he's more moderate. He's trying to mediate between the mountain, the Montagnards, and the Girondin. Montagnard, by the way, just means the mountain in French. It came from where they sat during the Estates General. He wanted to be more lenient. He thought we didn't need to execute all of the enemies of the revolution. That's not going to end well for him. Just a little spoiler alert. Jean-Paul Marat was this really fiery journalist who wrote these really scathing critiques of anti-revolutionaries. He was a really fierce defender of the Sans-Culottes. He published in these, he controlled these revolutionary newspapers and published a lot of pamphlets. He had this odd skin condition that had him spending much of his day in the bathtub, and that's where he would eventually be killed. This is a painting by Jacques-Louis David of the death of Marat. You can see him sitting in his bathtub and writing from his bathtub. He's killed by Charlotte Corday, who was a Girondin sympathizer, who stabbed him in the bathtub. A couple of other laws that were passed by the National Convention were the Law of General Maxim. So this is passed in September of 1793, and that put a price ceiling on grain. There were still, bread was still an issue. The people were still hungry. And so the price ceiling was meant to control the price of grain. What happened, though, is if you put a price ceiling on grain, instead of the invisible hand bringing everything to this like equilibrium point where you maximize everyone's satisfaction, you put a price ceiling on here. This is then how much is supplied, and this is how much is demanded. So basically you have a shortage of this amount. The Law of Suspects was passed in September of 1793, which basically said anyone could be suspect, which made it much easier to execute them in revolutionary tribunals. And it really gets pretty out of control. The Law of 22 Prairal in June of 1794 said that trials would now just decide between liberty or death. That's all you had to decide. Are we going to let them free, or are we going to execute them? The accused had no rights. The question was just, are you an enemy of the people? Did you forget your liberty cap today? Why do you hate the revolution? You then could be suspect. 1,500 are executed in that June and July of that year. And you can see this is a British pamphlet that comes out criticizing the guillotine. It says in the top, no God, no religion, no king, no constitution, the world on fire. You can see all the things they're trampling on down here, and they're like drunken and sort of crazy, right? Not very flattering depictions of revolutionaries. Here's another cartoon just showing the guillotine kind of out of control. Danton is eventually executed. He and the Indulgents, which were a group that also supported slowing executions, kind of his supporters, are executed. He was also accused of some profiteering. He might have been skimming off the top a little bit. I like the quote here on Danton's execution. Danton is dead, Robespierre triumphant. The tiger has beaten the lion, but the triumph will not last, if we can believe Danton's prediction on his way to the scaffold. And he was a man who understood revolutions. There's another revolt against the revolution in 1793. The Vendee revolt is against conscription and the anti-Catholic measures, the De-Christianization programs. The CPS is going to authorize scorched earth, basically letting them go into villages and kill anyone who's suspected of being involved, or just burn the whole village to the ground. There's a lot of atrocities here, and this is part of where the numbers from the Reign of Terror get so big. The question really about the Vendee is this counter-revolutionary, or is it just anti-revolution? Because those are different things. Counter-revolution would be, we want to put the king back in power. Anti-revolution means we just want to stop the chaos. A lot of the revoltees were drowned on barges set on fire in the river. Robespierre himself is executed on July 26, 1793. He gives a speech calling for one more purge of the National Convention. He says, there's still suspects out there. We have to get them. And so on July 27th, they're like, no, we're good. Knowing, of course, that they would then be suspect, right? So he's kind of attacked in the National Convention. He's stabbed in the brawl. And the next day he lies wounded during his trial and then is executed. And that begins what's called the Thermidorian reaction because I'm going the wrong way. Because it begins during the month of Thermidor. So that's where we're going to end today. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I will see you back soon. Bye.